Hello, White Davy here. Welcome to lesson 2 of module 4. Today we are going to be looking at how you can choose the worm bin that is right for you. The type of worm bin that you choose is important, and especially when dealing with limited space, then the type of worm bin is going to have a serious effect on the space that you have, the type of worms that you're raising, and why you are raising that worm or that particular type of worm will also influence the type of bin that you choose. Now, one of the things that us worm farmers do quite often is, as we are planning our worm farming business, we may look at other worm farming businesses and see what system they are using, and then we look at them, and based on the setup we decide if we like it, and that is how we decide what type of setup, what type of worm bins we're going to be using. But there are other factors, more serious factors, that we need to consider other than what looks nice. So I'm going to be going deep into that in this lesson. And so here are some of the things that you need to consider when you are going to choose your worm bins. Weight and your health, that's the first one. So when your bin is half or full, how much does it weigh? Is it something that you're going to be able to lift readily? What health condition are you in? Are you a young, healthy, strong person? Are you someone who is close to retirement, or you have health issues that may prevent you from being able to do a lot of lifting or heavy lifting? Or even if you are fairly healthy now, what age group are you in? Are you expecting your health to decline over the next 5 to 10 years? Will it affect the type of bins that you have to maintain, or your ability to maintain these bins? So these are some of the things that you need to consider before you choose your bin. The next one is the amount of space that you have for your wormery. Do you have a lot of space? Because if you have a lot of space, then it doesn't really matter what type of worm bin you choose if space is your focus. Now remember, all of these lists that I'm going to give you, you have to take all of them into consideration. So it's not just about space, it's not about weight, it's not just about health. It's the overall that you're going to be considering before you make your choice as to what worm bin you are going to be choosing. And as you think about weight, how many worm bins are you going to set up? How many are you able to move within the course of a day, over the course of a week? Are you raising worms for gardeners, or are you raising bait worms? Because that also is going to influence the type of bin that you're going to get. Are you going to be selling a combination of cocoons, hatchlings, juveniles, and adult worms? Or are you going to be selling a consistent size worm? What type of worm are you going to be selling? Because the type of worm also determines the size bin and the number of worms that you can have in each bin. How large do you want your operation to be? How small do you want your operation to be? Do you want worm bins that you have to move about, or do you want worm bins that you can maintain in place? So these are the factors that you're going to consider before choosing your worm bins. And the next thing that we're going to be discussing is the types of worm bins that are available. So here's the list of the most popular types of worm bins that are available. Stackables, and these are mostly used for personal purposes, but they can be used for commercial purposes as well. There is tray system, there is the continuous flow through system, which is called CFTs. There are windrows, and windows can be either indoors or outdoors, and there are totes. There can be large boxes of various types, whether wooden uh, bathtubs, it doesn't matter, but they are large boxes. And you can use buckets as well. And there are specialized bins that are created, like vermi bags, other types of bags that can be used for worm farming. So you can get creative as to what you are going to be using for your worm bin. So it doesn't have to be what everyone else is using. You can be as creative as you want, because at the end of the day, you have to choose the bin that works best for you. So we're going to be looking at each of these bins that I just mentioned. We're going to be giving a little detail about each of them so that you'll be more informed as you make your choice. So let's start by looking at the stackables. For the stackable worm bins, they are very easy to maintain. They don't get too heavy, which makes it perfect for retirees who want to do this business on the side. And it does not require a lot of heavy lifting. And because the worms migrate vertically, whether they're going up or down, then it makes harvesting both the worms and the castings easier. And a lot of these stackable bins are built where the bins themselves can be used as the sifter. So that is the advantage of using the stackable worm bins. Now the disadvantages of using the stackables is that they're small, so they can't hold a lot of worms, they can't hold a lot of castings. Now the good thing is that some of these stackables allow you to have between 3 to 7 tiers, so that is not too bad, but at the same time it does not hold a lot of worms at once. The other thing is that it reduces your working space, because you cannot put one stackable set on top of the other, so then you have the space above it that is just wasted space, unless of course you know how to get creative and to build shelves above that to put all your other stuff. So for example, your tools or anything else that you need to store. So you can get creative, but how much tools and other material are you going to need so that when you have these stackable trays, you can utilize all of the space above? So they do cause you to waste some amount of space. The next thing is that they can be quite expensive, because if you're buying 1 or 2 for personal purpose, then that's not too bad. But when you're purchasing it for a business, and depending on the brand that you get, it can become quite expensive. The next thing about using stackable is that you don't really have control over the breeding of your worms. The worms are just allowed to do as they please, which nothing is wrong with that. But when you want to do things like raise bait worms, you want to have control over the size of your worms, how many worms are in each bin. So having stackables is not the most ideal. And the next thing too is that when you use stackables, because each of the bin is so small, then what it does is require a lot more maintenance. And therefore, if you want to go on vacation, it can be a challenge to go, because you cannot prep your bin so that it can keep running in your absence, unless of course you're going away for maybe a week. But other than that, if you have to go away for 2 weeks, there's no way you can prep the bin for it to keep itself going over that period of time. And as you plan your worm farming business, you don't only want to think about the business aspect of it, you also want to think about how it affects your personal life. So being able to go on vacation is a part of what most of us desire, so we have to keep that in mind. Next, we are going to look at the tray system. The benefits of using trays is that they are ideal for bait worms. It's ideal when you want to control the size of the worms that you're raising. They're good for breeder bins. They save on space because you can create shelving for them. They do require some amount of lifting, but they have a reasonable amount of weight. They're very easy to maintain. They are some of the most popular types of worm bin for commercial entities. What are the disadvantages of using the tray system? They dry out more readily. They are shallow, which is not the best thing for night crawlers because these worms like to burrow down deep. But if you control the number of worms that you have in the bin, then these trays can be used for night crawlers as well. They don't come with covers, which means that rodents and other pests may easily get into them. They do require lifting of shelves, which means that sometimes, depending on how high you make your shelves, you might have to lift from overhead. So if weight or lifting is an issue, then you might want to consider whether or not you're going to be using a tray system, or if you decide to go with the tray system, then you might want to decide how high you're going to make your shelves. And depending on how high you make your shelf, you have to consider, will you need to use a platform, a ladder, or some other means of getting up high to maintain those worms? How much of those ups and downs can you manage? Or will you make the shelf just high enough where even if you have to reach overhead to get it, it is within your reach without you having to climb on something? Keep safety in mind as well, and if you have issues with knees or your ankles or the joints in your legs, then you might want to consider whether or not this is an appropriate choice for you. So the next thing about these trays is that using them, it can be a bit of a challenge if you want to go on vacation, because like I mentioned, they don't have covers, which means that they're going to dry out quite easily. And because they are so small, there is only so much that you can keep in them. But then for these type of trays, if you know what you are doing, you'll be able to get away for 2 weeks without having to maintain the bin. But if you want longer vacation, it can be a bit tricky. And if you are using the tray system and you want to go away on vacation, one of the things that you can do is to add as much bedding as you can to the worm bin, but not a lot of food scraps, because the food scraps can go bad, whereas the bedding don't really spoil. So add a lot of bedding, and usually add just a little bit more moisture than is recommended, so that will tie the worms over until you get back. And then you may want to cover that bin with cardboard and the plastic on top, whatever means you can use to ensure that it maintains the moisture. So even if they run out of food scraps, the worm can still feed on the bedding for the time that you are away. So that is how you will be able to get away for a 2-week vacation if you are using the tray system. And then the next thing with these tray system is that depending on how low you put your shelf, you may also have to do a lot of bending and lifting from low position. So if you have back injuries, then you might want to reconsider putting your trays down low, or whether or not you want to use the tray system. Now, if you want to use the tray system and you have issues with lifting from high or from down low, then one of the things that you can do to get the best result is to still use your tray system, but then you make it where your Shelving doesn't go all the way down to the ground, and where you have that shelving, you can have that area open where you store your castings underneath there, or any other large material can be stored underneath, so you don't have to be bending frequently to access those trays. And we're going to be discussing more on that further on in this course. And next we have the continuous flow through system, or the CFT. Now the CFT is the second most popular means of commercial worm farming because it makes harvesting the castings much easier. It doesn't require a lot of bending, it doesn't require lifting, apart from lifting the castings that have been harvested. But you don't have to be lifting individual bins when you want to maintain it, and that is a big plus. It is fairly easy to maintain, and it allows you to go on vacation for a long time if you use the similar principle that was mentioned for the tray system, where you had a lot of bedding. Then you can moisten it and go. Harvesting becomes quite easy. Feeding is quite easy because you're just accessing from the top, putting the food scraps on the top of the bin, moistening the top of the bin, so it is quite easy to access. Now, if you're going to be using the continuous flow through system, one of the things that you need to consider, especially if you're going to be creating your own, is how much space do you have. If your flow through system is going to be up against a wall, it means that that section of the bin that is against the wall, you will not be able to access it if you make your bins too wide. So keep in mind your height, and if you're going to have employees, what is the average height of your employees, and will they be able to bend over to access the section of your flow through system that is going to be up against the wall. So what are the disadvantages of using the continuous flow through system? Well, for one, you have no control over the size of the worms that you are producing. So say, for example, you're raising bait worms and you want them to be a particular size. You don't have control over that because the bin contains worms of all ages. In a lot of cases, these bins are not covered, which means that you're going to have to create a cover for them. If you're creating your own, then that's good because you can create your cover for them. If you're purchasing flow through system, you may have to come up with a way to keep it covered so that you can maintain moisture. The thing with the continuous flow through system though is that it creates a lot of wasted space because you have all that space above it that is not being used. So as you create your bin, keep the width of your worm bin. If whether you're creating or purchasing, keep the width of your CFTs in mind because you want to have easy access. So if you have a lot of space and you're going to have worm bins that are going to be in rows lined beside each other, then those that are going to be on the interior of the building, doesn't really matter what width they are or what length they are, but then those that are going to be up against the wall, the width does matter. And next is the windrow system. Windrows can be cooler for your worms. They're very easy to maintain, and you can use the horizontal migration to look after your worms. So you feed at one end, food scraps and bedding, and as the worms work on that, you add more material next to that and the worms will migrate, and you just keep following the length of your windrow. They're very easy to maintain. One of the good thing is that it does not require any lifting of bins, that is. So you may have to lift the material to put in the worm bin, you may have to lift the worms out, lift the castings out, but you don't have to move the worm bin when you're maintaining it, and that is a plus where windrows are concerned. One of the disadvantages though is that it may lose the moisture because the soil will wick some of the moisture away. The next disadvantage is that the worms can escape, and if you're using different types of, if you're raising different types of worms, then you may end up with worms exchanging homes then, as it were. So you don't want your worms to be mixed unless that is your preference. So if you are using the windrow system, then you may have to come up with ways to design your wormery so that the worms, different types of worms, cannot enter other worm bins. Now, the windrow system, the good thing is that it can be indoors and it can be outdoors. Now, if you're going to be using windrows outdoors, you have to keep weather conditions in mind. Do you experience freezing temperatures where you are? What can you do to keep your worms warm if they're going to be in outdoor windrows during the winter? The next thing that you need to consider, do you have rainy or dry season? How often will you need to moisten your windrow if you are keeping it outdoors? How often will you be able to cover your wormery so that the rain does not flood your worm bins? Because if you are not able to keep it covered, then you may find that your windrows will fill up with moisture and you can lose your worms. And the next disadvantage is that you don't really have control over the size of your worms when you use the windrow system either. But the horizontal migration method of maintaining your bin make it easier for you to harvest your worms and your castings without you having to do as much sifting. Next is the totes. Now, these have a lot of advantages because, for one, because of the amount of space that they provide, the bins can be filled all the way up with bedding and then food added as needed, which means that the more space that you have in your bin, similar to the windrow and the CFTs, the more space you have, the more your worms are going to be multiplied if you had enough content for your worms to spread out in. So this is one of the advantages of using the tote system. It is very easy to maintain and it retains moisture. You can have it indoors or outdoors. It is cheap and you have some control over the size of your worms, but not much. And when you use the tote as your worm bin, then it is easier for you to go on vacation by adding more bedding and more moisture. These can maintain moisture longer than a lot of the other types of worm bin, which makes it perfect for you to go on longer vacations. Now, what are some of the disadvantages of using totes though? They're heavy and they do require a lot of lifting to maintain. The good thing is that you can create shelving for them, but then if you have shelving for totes, how high can you go with them because they are quite heavy? And if you go low down to the ground with them, you're gonna have to do a lot of bending. So again, you have to keep that in mind. And another disadvantage of using the tote is that it sweats and traps moisture, and when it is outdoors it can get quite hot unless you have it in shaded areas. And chances are, if you are going to be using totes for your worm bin, or if you're going to be having your wormery outdoors, then you don't want to use totes if you experience cold winters, because then you're going to have all of those heavy bins to transport indoors, unless of course you're going to build wheelies or put them on wheelies so that you can just slide them into a heated area for the winter. But outside of that, totes can be quite heavy to move about. Next, you can use large wooden boxes, and similar to windrows and flow-through systems, they have a lot of space, so worms can multiply faster depending on how much bedding you will add to those bins. And also, they're much easier to maintain as well. They may be able to hold more moisture because you can add more content to the bin. They can be placed on wheels so that they can be moved about, so that is another advantage. And the good thing is that they do not require lifting, and you can use the horizontal migration, or you can just treat it as a regular tote and feed your bin accordingly. So there are various advantages to using large boxes. And for large boxes, they can be just about any type of box really. It can be made of wood, it can be large plastic containers, it can be an old fridge, it can be a bathtub. So there are various options when it comes to large boxes for your worm bins. The problem with it though is that it wastes a lot of space again. Now, if you're going to be building boxes, or even if you're going to be using old fridge or an old bathtub for your worm bins, then you can put them on stand where they're up high enough where you can maintain them, and underneath it you can have the containers that the castings that is harvested from it is going to be stored. You can build it with a drawer directly underneath the bins so that you can keep your tools there, or you can put shelving above it. But then if you're going to be putting shelving above things like your CFTs, your boxes, or anything of that sort that takes up a lot of space that you have to bend over to maintain, then you need to consider your head space, because as you bend over, you don't want to be bumping your head into shelving and the things like that. So as you design your worm farm, it is important to take those things into consideration. And again, if you're going to be having employees, you need to take their height into consideration as well. Could you employ someone who is tall or someone who is short? So think in terms of you having a tall employee, well, the average tall employee, because you don't really want to plan for the ones that is not the norm, right? So keep that in mind as you design your worm farm if you're going to be using things like CFDs and large boxes. So what are some of the disadvantages if you're using wooden boxes? They rot, they wick moisture, and they waste a lot of space, as I mentioned before. Now, if you're going to be using if you're going to be using things like old bathtubs, then these do rot, but they do take a long time. As to whether or not the metal will wick into the castings, I am not certain about what happens there. For the refrigerators, I am not certain, because you can find those that are metallic or you can find those that are plastic based. Now, the good thing about these is that you can always find them at landfill or places that do recycling. So if you are looking for a cheap option to have a lot of worm bins, then you may want to consider this option. Now, the next one we're going to be looking at is using buckets for your worm bin. Now, the advantage of using buckets is that you can stock them in a similar manner as you would with a cement trays. Now, some who use buckets for their wormery just simply stack the bucket on top of each other using a little spacer. But the disadvantage of doing that is that you have to remove one in order to access the one that is below. And if you're thinking in terms of time, then that might not be the best option for you. So create shelving for you. Yes, you have to do some amount of lifting, but in a lot of cases these buckets weighs the same amount as one of the trays. So from my experience, if you use a 5-gallon bucket, it will be lighter than using a tray, but the only thing is that it is a bit cumbersome because of the bulkiness of it to take it up and down from off the shelves. But buckets can be used in a similar way to using the tray system. Now, the disadvantage is that the bin is narrow when you use buckets, and because it is narrow, if you are someone who just surface feeds, then it means that your worms are going to be on the surface, which means that you're going to be able to have only a few worms, like a pound of worms, maybe 2 pounds of worms in that bucket. Whereas if you fill that bucket up, you can have more worms in it. When you use bucket, it retains moisture. If it is outdoors, it can trap heat. So the advantage is that if it holds moisture, then you're able to go on vacation for 2 or 3 weeks without having to worry too much about your worms having enough moisture. And one of the things about worms is that you don't want them to suffer. Yes, true. But worms are resilient, and so if they don't have food, they can recycle their own waste. But if they don't have enough moisture, then that is just a definite no-no. They're not going to be able to survive. So it is important, if you're going on vacation, irrespective of what type of worm bin you choose, that you ensure that your worms are going to have enough moisture to keep them for the time that you're gone. And if in doubt, it is recommended that you get someone to look after your worms, and don't just wait until a few days before you leave to ask the person to look after your worms and tell them what to do. But whenever that person is available, a few weeks before you go on your vacation, you have them over and you train them how to look after your worms. This is very important because a lot of my clients have told me that they ask a relative, a friend, or someone to look after their worms, and when they get back from their vacation, they find that most of the worms, or all of the worms, are gone. So spend the time. If you're going on vacation and you're going to be gone longer than your worms can survive without you, spend the time, a few weeks leading up to your vacation. Whenever you have the chance, you get that person who's going to be looking after your worms to come over, and you train them as to how to look after your worms. And it doesn't hurt to have a backup plan where if you have one person who is going to be looking after your worms, can you find someone else who is going to come in to see whether or not the worms are being looked after, and they can fill in for that person and train that person as well. Because at the end of the day, you don't want to be unable to go on vacation because of your worms, because the whole purpose of doing a business is so that you can enjoy a nice family life, right? And benefit from your worm business. Your worm business is supposed to help your family life. So you don't want to find yourself in a situation where you can't go on vacation because of your worms, and you don't want to find yourself in a situation where you go on vacation and you lose your business either, or you have to start all over again. So spend the time and plan well. And one of the things about, yes, I strayed from the point. I should have discussed this after, not now. One of the things about using the buckets too is that it is very easy to maintain, and you can control the size of your worms when you use the bucket system. And in most cases, depending on where you're sourcing your buckets, they do have covers. So that is good because it helps to keep pests out of your worm bin. So far we have looked at when time is not enough, and we have covered how you can choose the worm bin that is best for you. So now I hope you're going to spend the time and do the assignment, because it is going to help you to see how you can decide which worm bin suits your circumstances best, and you'll be able to arrange how you want to set up your worm bin. And so now we're going to be moving into when space is not enough.